within their own country, within the United Kingdom? And will he also confirm whether that will apply going back in the opposite direction or not?
As I said in response to the earlier question, I'm very happy to confirm that it is the case that in respect of some international obligations, then there will be occasions where information is needed electronically for the movement of goods, and that is in accordance with international obligations. But the reality is, he talks about bouncing decision-making. We've already had 2 extensions. The House has debated these issues endlessly. The withdrawal agreement, the first version of the withdrawal agreement, was published as long ago as last November. The reality is he doesn't want any Brexit. He wants a second referendum. He wants to remain, and he will do everything he can to frustrate Brexit happening.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can we write another letter to the European Union saying that we utterly oppose having a second referendum? And does my right honourable friend not agree that a second referendum is a betrayal of many thousands of Harlow voters who voted to leave and millions of working people across the country? We should respect democracy and implement the result of 2016.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. A second referendum would simply take us back to square one. It would create huge uncertainty, huge delay, and prolong the paralysis of this Parliament when we need a general election and to let the people decide.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to return to the issue of the economic impact assessment, because the effect of all this on manufacturing in my constituency in particular is absolutely critical. So I don't know whether the government are unwilling or unable to release any information they've got on this, but surely the Minister can see how important it is that we have all this information before we make any decisions. After all, he wouldn't buy a house without looking at the deeds, would he?
But the point that is missing is the free trade agreement is still to be negotiated, and what is causing damage to businesses in his constituency and elsewhere is reflected in, for example, the comments of people like Lord Rose, who was a leader of the Remain campaign, who now recognises that what is damaging to business is the ongoing uncertainty. We need to bring that uncertainty to an end, and it is his continued refusal to vote both for a deal whilst also opposing no deal, which is prolonging the uncertainty and damaging the interests of businesses in his constituency.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you stayed tuned to the Andrew Marr show after watching Match of the Day yesterday morning, but if you did, you'd have heard the Right Honourable Member for Esher and Walton say that Parliament cannot muzzle the Prime Minister. He doesn't want an extension. He should be at liberty to tell the EU that. Does my Right Honourable friend agree?
I very much agree. I don't think it will come as a surprise to colleagues in Europe as to what the view of the Prime Minister is. He has been clear from day one that he wanted a deal, despite many voices in this House suggesting otherwise, and he's been clear that it's in the country's interest to leave on the 31st of October. That remains his commitment, and that is exactly what the government is committed to doing.
I think the honourable gentleman was referring to a show at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yes, I do periodically watch that programme. It isn't sort of top of my list of priorities, but occasionally I will observe it. But I'm bound to say it was a rather greater priority yesterday morning at 9 o'clock to be playing tennis.
Exactly. Very wise.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the unsigned letter the Prime Minister refused even to grace with his name, he sent another letter which he signed in his own name, effectively saying, "Dear Donald, please ignore the first letter I've sent you. I only sent it to comply with an Act of Parliament." If it was not the purpose of that second letter to deliberately attempt to frustrate an Act of this Parliament, what on earth was the second letter for?
Well, as I have said in response to several questions now, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is entitled to express his view. That should not come as a surprise to the honourable gentleman. He has complied with the law. Leading legal figures such as Lord Pannick accept that he has complied with the law. But in addition, he has set out his view as he's entitled to do.
Which side of that is it now? Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, I hadn't planned standing and just wanted to make a clear point that match of the day every time trumps anything else, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. But I would want to my right honourable friend that can he just explain to me, as it is now finally it appears to be the opposition's position, although I'm never quite clear whether that will change next week, that they want to have a second referendum. Could he then explain to me what could anybody say to the British public when they go out and say, we didn't trust you last time, now you have to trust us that we will trust you again on a second referendum. How could they possibly believe or trust British politicians?
I must tell the Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green that he shares that penchant with the late and great Anthony Crossland, who greatly enjoyed watching Match of the Day. Would often have colleagues around the dinner table in his home, and they would be discussing political matters. But moments before Match of the Day, Crossland would make it very clear that all further political discussion must cease as he proposed to watch the programme, and he would usually don a bobble hat whilst doing so. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps we could have a similar tradition for the remaining duration of the Rugby World Cup, which I'm sure across the House many members would also enjoy applying that maxim to. My friend is absolutely correct in terms of, well, firstly, the position of the opposition. I appreciate it has moved rather a lot and rather frequently. But if I take the position set out by the Shadow Brexit Secretary on Sunday, it clearly was for a second referendum. And that is odd, given that they don't trust the people with the first referendum. But the question the Leader of the Opposition isn't answering and needs to answer is, how long does he expect the primary legislation to take? How long does he expect the question testing from the Electoral Commission? How long does he expect the operational preparations to take? And how long does he expect the regulated campaign period to be for? Now, if his position is to have a second referendum, we need answers to those questions, because he risks leaving this Parliament in paralysis because he's not answering how long he wants to delay Brexit for.
Martin Whitfield.
Mr. Speaker, just to clarify a statement that the Secretary of State made earlier about the Bank of England, they were of course comparing the current withdrawal agreement to a no deal rather than the current economy. But to answer my young constituents, could the Secretary of State say whether he has ever sent a letter that he has not had the courtesy to sign?
No. As I think with all MPs, there are occasions, for example, that I have dictated letters to my parliamentary office, and they have taken as dictated and signed on my behalf.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch fawr iawn, Mr. Speaker. When you mentioned your activities at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I was rather hoping that you'd say that the pressing engagement was a very famous Welsh rugby victory in the quarter-final of the World Cup. Slightly fortunate, but a very famous victory nonetheless. When it comes to the more complicated matter of the future trade relations, every single member state of the European Union, including some constituent parts, such as Wallonia in Belgium, will have to endorse the final FTA. The withdrawal agreement and the political declaration makes no mention of the British government having to seek the consent of the Senedd in Cardiff, or indeed the Scottish Parliament. So why is it therefore, as things stands, will Wallonia, a constituent part of the Belgian state, have more influence over the future FTA with the EU than Wales and Scotland?
The Honourable raises an important point, actually, as to how, as we take forward the negotiations, we engage with the devolved assemblies. It is a very fair point. It is one we're very keen to address, and I also to recognise that there have been concerns, particularly in terms of the first phase, as to the effectiveness of the JMC in terms of those discussions. One of the things within my own department I changed was to ask officials to engage at official level much more. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I know, spoke with both the Scottish and Welsh governments in the last day or so. They also, along with the Minister of State within my department, went up to Edinburgh for those meetings. But he raises a very fair point, and it is one that I'm very keen to work with him on.
Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, Parliament voted by acclamation on Saturday to in effect pass the withdrawal agreement as amended on that motion. So will the Minister now confirm that when the withdrawal agreement bill comes before the House at the various stages of the bill, that the Government will respect if this House does decide to amend it in certain different ways? And we've seen, obviously, a commitment by the Government before to respect the indicative votes. If we see a majority emerge in this House for amendments to that bill, will the Government respect it?
The Honourable Gentleman will get an opportunity to see the withdrawal agreement bill once the two UQs are finished. And in terms of amendments, clearly he'll be aware that the scope of the bill is quite wide, but it will always be for the Chair, the Speaker, or indeed the Chairman of Ways and Means in terms of what amendments are selected.
Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has pretended that the Government is unable to make economic forecasts of a new Brexit deal on the basis that things may change in the Commission or in the world economic environment. But it is the case, of course, that the Treasury consistently makes forecasts on what the size of the economy would be relative to what it would be if we stayed in the EU versus various scenarios. So clearly what he's saying is false. And what is the case is that projection is approximately a 5% reduction in the size of our economy. When will the Treasury and the Government come forward with a detailed analysis of how much poorer the poorest will be, how much more corporation tax businesses will have to pay when they're facing a huge burden of red tape, how will the public accounts be faced, and what will be the impact, so that people can judge what's on the plate, having ordered on the menu, and then vote again in a people's vote, so they get what they order on the menu rather than his garbage.
What I was pointing to is just an economic reality, is that one can set out, and the Treasury frequently does, broad landing zones, but forecasts are inherently difficult because there are so many variables that shape what happens. And to say with absolute certainty where things will be in 2033, which is where the forecast would be trying to determine a precise landing zone, I think is open to significant challenge. And we saw that not just on these benches when the Treasury presented the Cross-Whitehall analysis last November, but it was also on the benches opposite the sort of questions he and others were making.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland if he'll make a statement on progress to restore devolution in the light of today's decision, extension of the period in which the legal duty to call an Assembly election is removed under Section 2 of the Executive Functions Act of 2019.
Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The period for executive formation under the terms of the Northern Ireland Act, Executive Formation and Exercise of Functions 2018, is due to expire at the end of today, Monday, the 21st of October. So today I have laid before Parliament a statutory instrument to extend the period for executive formation to 13th of January 2020. That has the effect of ensuring that Northern Ireland departments can continue to make decisions in accordance with the Act in the absence of executive ministers. Colleagues should be clear that the Act only provides guidance to the Northern Ireland Civil Service and is no substitute for everyday political decision-making. In reflecting on hundreds of interactions I have had with public sector workers, voluntary workers and members of the public, this continued absence is a huge disappointment. This extension also delays the legal obligation on me to call an Assembly election, but does not prevent me from calling an Assembly election at any time. The political parties have not reached an agreement to get Stormont back up and running, but extending this legal deadline has no bearing on my continuing efforts to restore the executive. And as a result, from tomorrow, in relation to abortion law in Northern Ireland, sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 are repealed, in addition to a moratorium on criminal prosecutions. A new legal framework for lawful access to abortion services in Northern Ireland will be put in place by 31st of March 2020, in line with the 2018 UN CEDAW report. I will be consulting on the new framework very soon. On same-sex marriage and opposite-sex civil partnerships, regulations are to be made no later than 13th of January 2020. There are two key areas we are going to consult on: how to allow for religious same-sex marriage ceremonies, and also the issue of conversion from civil partnership to marriage and vice versa. So we can tailor the regulations appropriately. There will be a short consultation on these two issues before we introduce religious same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. This will not detract from the regulations by 13th of January 2020, providing for civil same-sex marriages and opposite-sex civil partnerships. This means at the latest, the first civil same-sex marriages will take place on the week of Valentine's Day 2020. We also intend to launch a public consultation on a scheme for payments to victims of Troubles-related incidents in the coming days. I'm also determined to ensure that the government delivers on our commitments to broader legacy issues. I cannot understate, Mr. Speaker, the responsibilities of the Northern Ireland parties to finding an accommodation and ensuring the future of the devolved institutions that formed such an essential part of the peace process.
Thank you. Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by thanking you for granting this very important urgent question? Both the quantity and the importance of the issues the Secretary of State has already raised with the House indicates how important it is that we have regular dialogue on Northern Ireland. And let me say to government business managers, that hasn't been forthcoming in the level to which we would expect. But can I ask the Secretary of State a number of very specific questions? Brexit, according to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, may still result in the crash-out version. Is the Secretary of State certain that he has already in preparation the necessary legislative changes to bring before this House in the event of that no-deal Brexit? But even if we have Brexit with the deal, is the Secretary of State satisfied that the Northern Ireland Civil Service, under the legislation that exists, have the necessary authority to make the very difficult decisions that they and indeed other agencies may have to make as we move through that Brexit process? And in particular, can he assure the House that the Police Service of Northern Ireland have the resources in the event of any form of civic disturbance? I don't want to emphasise what kind of disturbance there could be, but we may face a period of prolonged public unrest. Does the PSNI have the resources and the capacity to play that role? And will he actually at this stage also rule out, as we've had in the past, any idea that the Army could once again be recommitted into Northern Ireland? Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State mentioned the important issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. Can you tell the House, if Stormont is to return in the period between now and January the 13th, will he work with Stormont to make sure that we have an acceptable solution, since Stormont will, in the post-April the 1st, have the capacity to alter any such law? Will he make sure that the processes involved will be ones that Stormont and his department work together to make sure that we can have safe and legal abortion for the women of Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland, and that same-sex marriage can take place in Northern Ireland? Mr. Speaker, in the event that Stormont doesn't return, the Secretary of State needs to plan now for what will happen on January the 13th. We know how quickly time goes by in the context of Northern Ireland, how quickly time has already gone by, 1,000 days plus since Stormont met. The Secretary of State will face a difficult decision, and I would say to him that direct rule is a very unattractive proposition for many, many reasons. He may have to look at the election option to renew the mandate of a Stormont Assembly that hasn't met for so long. But in any event, will he guarantee that he will work with the government, the Irish government in Dublin, to make sure that strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement is one that is respected? But, Mr. Speaker, if I can finish on this point, there is unease across the unionist community about the Prime Minister's decision to change the terms under which consent is given by Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was very clear about the need to take both communities together through any decision-making around important constitutional issues for Northern Ireland. Does the Secretary of State accept the unease of the unionist community? Does he also accept he now has a duty to work hard to regain that trust, a trust actually, frankly, that has been betrayed by the decisions of Conservative MPs who once were unionists and now have abandoned their erstwhile friends?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of legislation and powers in the case of no deal, I've been very clear, no deal is not a good situation for the United Kingdom, and particularly for Northern Ireland, and I hope now the Prime Minister has secured a deal, we can focus on getting that deal over the line. On the Northern Ireland Civil Service, who I paid tribute to this afternoon, they have been the most dedicated civil servants in pushing forward across a range of areas without political decision-making. I believe they do have some powers and political decision guidance from this bill, but it's inadequate, and we need to get Stormont back up and running in order to ensure that they have the political direction that they need. On PSNI and security, the government has invested a further £20 million, or nearly £20 million, and stands ready to continue to support the PSNI financially. I'm obviously responsible in this role for security. This is a sensitive period with police officers under threat day in, day out, but I am comforted that the PSNI is well resourced and I think is doing an exceptional job. And I will keep that monitored and keep in touch with the honourable gentleman in that regard. On the question of the Army, I don't see that any need for any circumstance for the British Army operating in that way. The PSNI are doing all of the functions along with our security services in an exceptional manner. On abortion and same-sex marriage, there is clearly this concern about how does the Assembly now the law is changing, how does it influence? It can influence, but we need to be clear the law from tomorrow has changed across those two areas, and we will hear the views of the Assembly and we will work with them, but the law from tomorrow has changed. On the issue of Stormont return, and if it doesn't return, the consequences of Stormont not getting back up and running are, I think, too profound to consider. We have to get this institution back up and running. Powers from Westminster will involve working with Dublin, will involve a whole range of issues that we shouldn't be having to address. Those men and women who work so hard for peace in Northern Ireland need and continue to remind us that we have to get Stormont back up and running. And I'll be working, as I've been working over the summer, to get, along with the Irish government, to get this crucial institution running again. On the issue of consent, this protocol has been subject to huge debate over the last few days. We've got to remember that one of the biggest criticisms of the last withdrawal agreement was the fact that it needed more say for Northern Ireland. It will have no impact on the petition of concern, on the day-to-day operation of the Assembly. This is an exceptional matter. It is a reserved matter consulting the Assembly. We will be doing everything we can to ensure we make that clear. I've been speaking to members of the unionist community across the weekend, but we do need to ensure that we now get this deal over the line for the United Kingdom and for Northern Ireland.
Order. Momentarily, we will continue with the exchanges on the urgent question. Nominations closed at 5 o'clock this afternoon for candidates for the post of Chair of the Backbench Business Committee. One nomination has been received. A ballot will therefore not be held. I congratulate, and I hope the House will join me in congratulating the honourable gentleman, the member for Gateshead, Mr Ian Mearns, on his re-election as Chair of the Backbench Business Committee. The assiduity and public-spiritedness of the honourable gentleman are renowned throughout the House. Thank you. 4 nominations were received for the post of Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and a ballot will be held between 10 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. on the 23rd of October in Committee Room 15. Order. The Chair of the Select Committee, Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Northern Ireland clearly want to see Stormont back up and running because they're seeing their health, their education and their welfare suffer. But by making this extension, the Secretary of State has provided a window, Mr. Speaker, which could possibly see this House overcome the hurdle which seems insurmountable for the parties in Northern Ireland, and that is to legislate for the Irish Language Act. therefore taking it out of the debate between the principal parties in Northern Ireland, and in my judgment removing the hurdle, which is the roadblock, sorry for mixing my metaphors, to getting Stormont back up and running.
Mr. Speaker, the Irish Language Act is one of a number of issues that are being discussed in the talks process. I'd say again, I think the most important and the best way to resolve these issues is through the Stormont talks, and I will continue to work at pace with the Taoiseach to ensure that we encourage parties to come back together and get back into an executive.
3 statements to follow, so we do need to expedite progress, and Gavin Newlands can lead us in that mission. Mr. Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stormont, and more importantly, the people of Northern Ireland, have now been without a functioning executive for over 1,000 days. In the Government's report on executive formation, it stated that the UK Government, working closely with the Irish Government, will now intensify its efforts to put compromise solutions to the parties. Mr. Speaker, there are no formal talks between the parties at the moment. Now, I fully accept that the Government cannot bind the hands of the parties involved, but can the Secretary of State tell us, with no current talks, what exactly the Government meant by intensifying efforts, and can he tell us when fresh party talks will take place? The Government's reckless Brexit policy and its agreement with the DUP has severely undermined the delicate balance of relationships that are built and sustained the Good Friday Agreement. But given the breakdown in the Government's relationship with the DUP, does he envisage this will have an impact on efforts to restore the Assembly and Executive? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Government has confirmed the imposition of direct rule as being considered. This is deeply disappointing. It is clear that devolved decisions are best made by the elected politicians of Northern Ireland, and I urge them to get back round the table and to get back to work.
Mr. Speaker, I have been personally meeting with the parties since taking on this job almost on a weekly basis, but as my honourable friend has acknowledged, this is an issue for the 5 parties, and it is ultimately up to those parties to come together, and both the Irish Government and the British Government stand ready with ideas, with thoughts, in order to make that happen. On the relationship between the Government and the DUP,